Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Thursday evening, joined by Roman Catholic John Salza. How are you doing, Mr. Salza?
Good evening, Michael. Good to be with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for coming on. It's excellent. I have long been a fan of your book here, True or False Pope. I'm sure everybody in the audience who's watching is also familiar with it. This was published and also endorsed by Bernard Fillet from the SSPX, but this was published by St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary. Is that correct? Is that the publisher on here?
That's correct.
And I'm going to put a link to this at the description at the bottom of this video. And I imagine you would just want me to put a link to the Amazon website. Is that best place where people could purchase this book?
Yes. Currently, the book is almost out of print.
Yeah.
But as we talked offline, Robert and I are working on what we didn't expect as we entered into this project, but we're going to be releasing a 3-volume set.
Yeah.
The past couple years, we've actually been working just on the first part of the book, and we have found a number of previously unpublished texts from St. Robert Bellarmine and other doctors and fathers from the church that simply support everything that we've written in the first edition. Mm-hmm. And so we're hoping to get the first volume of a 3-volume set out in the next few months, but I think the first volume alone will be in the neighborhood of 500 pages or more. So we're really excited about this.
Yeah.
Because again, this is going to be previously unpublished material from the original Latin sources, obviously translated into English. Mm-hmm. And again, simply bolstering what we presented thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like y'all have offered the most comprehensive treatment so far that I've seen of Sedevacantism. I've really never seen anything this thick as far as a treatise on the topic. To my knowledge, there's nothing else out there. So it looks like y'all have done a very, very commendable work. And I've read through large portions of it, and it's absolutely excellent. It was very helpful for my own theology and trying to understand this material. And I want to dive into this and start asking some questions about it. But before I do that, let me go ahead and introduce you formally, and I'll read from the bio here. John Salza is cum laude graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School, a practicing attorney for over 20 years. Mr. Salza is also widely acclaimed Catholic writer and is also a speaker. He is the author of 11 books on topics of Catholic doctrine, scripture, Fatima, and Freemasonry, including the biblical basis for apologetic series. And he's also contributed to our Sunday Visitor, St. Benedict's Press. He has been the author of The Mystery of Predestination According to Scripture, the Church, and Thomas Aquinas, published by 10 books. You have been on The Remnant. You've contributed to them, Church Militant, the Discovery Channel, EWTN. And of course, everyone can find out more information about Mr. Salza, including his books, articles, and videos at johnsalza.com. And you could also go to trueorfalsepope.com, which is the website for this book that we're going to be discussing. So let's dive in and talk about this. Why did you feel it was necessary to write this book, True or False Pope, refuting Sedevacantism and other modern errors? What was the impetus behind this?
Well, the crisis really has spurred us to do it because, as Robert and I have discussed, even we many, many years ago wondered how this could possibly happen to the church. Mm-hmm. Could this be the real Pope? I mean, we had these questions and we never formally embraced the error that it couldn't be, but we wanted to investigate with an open mind what the arguments were for and against the position. Yeah. And as we dug into, the theologians, the fathers, the doctors, the theological manuals, it became very evident. Even studying church history, we've had a lot of bad popes. We've had popes that have engaged in public acts of apostasy and heresy, and yet they didn't lose their office. In fact, we can't think of one single Catholic bishop throughout the history of the Catholic Church who lost their office for heresy while they peacefully, reigned and possessed their see. It hasn't happened. Now, the theologians acknowledge that it is theologically possible for a cleric to lose their office for heresy. Mm-hmm. We'll probably discuss the requirements for that to happen are very stringent and very clear. And ultimately, it comes from the judgment of the church, who is the public authority over those who hold public offices in the church.
Okay. So essentially, it's the church that can declare who is actually in the place of, let's say, the office of bishop. So it's not up to me as a layman to determine, okay, that bishop has deposed himself or has been deposed by God, or is now a manifest heretic, so he's not able to hold public office. Could you maybe dive into that and talk about that a little bit? Because here's some of the problems that I see. There's a lot of people out there who look at Pope Francis or other individuals, but especially Pope Francis, and they will see a lot of concerns, whether it's in things that he teaches or it's just in his actions. And they will say, this cannot possibly be the Pope. Surely he wasn't eligible for the papacy, or if he was the true Pope at some point, he lost office. What are some of the problems and difficulties with me as an individual making that determination about the Pope?
And none of this is to minimize the grave damage that Pope Francis has done to the church. I want to be clear about that. I also do want to say, Michael, though, that it hasn't just been Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. All of the conciliar popes, to one extent or another, have wreaked havoc upon the Catholic Church. Yeah. Paul VI, John Paul II, and Francis, Benedict to some extent, but he also had some orthodoxy as well. So let's not say this is all about Francis. Francis is simply finishing off the conciliar revolution that Paul VI put into action, and to some extent John the 23rd, but really Paul VI with the Second Vatican Council and the new Mass. So those popes did many things that were contrary to the faith in addition of Francis, and this is not to minimize what Francis has done. I think, Michael, that before we get into some of the actual teachings on heresy, I think Catholics have been more troubled by Francis because of his attack on the moral theology of the church. Mm-hmm. Never before have popes attacked the moral theology as this pope has done, with implicitly saying that, fornicators can receive Holy Communion. Mm-hmm. I mean, Paul VI and John Paul II never did anything of the sort, right? And because the moral teachings seem to be a little bit more familiar to Catholics, obviously the sanctity of marriage, two become one flesh, we have to be in a state of grace to receive communion, all those things, that when those things are somehow called into question or attacked by the Vicar of Christ himself, it has a visceral reaction, and it should. But if we look at some of the things that Paul VI and John Paul II did, one can say they attacked the first commandment itself, with non-Catholics. That's a graver sin than some of the sins that Francis has been promoting. Now, he's also done false worship and everything else. But what I'm saying is, it seems like for the average Catholic, maybe the aberrations of the doctrinal teachings of the church are more hard to discern. But when there's attack on the moral teachings of the church, that has more of a resounding thing in a Catholic. And that's why I think, and Francis is worse than all of them. I'm not saying he isn't, but I'm saying it's because of his attack on the morality of the church that I think has caused such angst about this papacy.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I think that Pope Francis is definitely the most problematic of all post-conciliar popes, but this is not something unique to him. We have issues with Benedict XVI, and we definitely have some issues with John Paul II, Pope Paul VI, even going back to John the 23rd. Yeah. And perhaps we can get into some of those things, but one of the things that I'm constantly seeing coming up is that people will throw out there that Pope Francis is a manifest heretic, and therefore he is not qualified to be the Pope. What would you say to those who would say that he is a manifest heretic? Would you agree with that?
No, he's not a manifest heretic according to the judgment of the church, and that's the only judgment that matters.
Okay, and so maybe define that for me.
Sure. If you refer to St. Robert Bellarmine, and I love quoting Bellarmine because the Sedevacantists have used and abused him for many, many years. Mm-hmm. We've demonstrated in our book that they don't understand St. Robert Bellarmine, and when they see the new quotes that we have from him, they'll never be able to refer to him again. Yeah. Robert Bellarmine held that a manifest heretic loses his office ipso facto. Okay, that's true. He did hold that. But what are the conditions that precede the loss of office? St. Robert was very clear that the cleric would either have to openly leave the church or be cut off by the church's judgment. There is an antecedent judgment that's made by the church prior to the ipso facto loss of office taking place. Okay. And St. Robert was very clear about this. He said that in the case of heresy, the Pope can be judged. Now, how do we reconcile that with the principle that the Pope is judged by no one, that the First See is judged by no one? You can reconcile it, and this is again what the Sedevacantists have missed here. The First See is judged by no one means that no one has legal or coercive authority over the Pope on earth. We cannot judge the Pope in that way. What St. Robert has said, and we say some of this in our book, but we're going to be coming out with more information on this in the second edition. He says that the Church can engage in what he calls a discretionary judgment of the Pope. It's an antecedent or discretionary judgment. It's not a legal or coercive judgment over the Pope, but rather it's a process by which the Church determines whether the elements for the crime of heresy have been committed. So it's a judgment of the facts and not the Pope as a person. Again, not coercive, but what he calls, St. Robert calls, discretionary. Think of it as an arbiter in an arbitration. He's weighing the facts and he's trying to determine and establish what facts exist to determine whether, in fact, the subject is guilty of the crime charged. Now, even before we get there, though, Michael, we would have a process by which the cardinals would formally warn the Pope. And again, this is not a juridical process. They accuse us of saying that and we're judging the Pope. No, these are what the theologians have said are acts of fraternal correction made in charity, but they're confronting the Pope about his teaching. They're saying, Holy Father, this is what you've taught. This is what the Church teaches. If you're denying or doubting what the Church teaches, you are a formal heretic. So they're giving the Pope an opportunity to conform himself to the teachings of the Church and repent of the heresy. There's a material element and a formal element, right? So as part of this process, this discretionary judgment, the Church first had to determine whether there's the material element. Has he objectively denied or doubted a truth of the faith which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith? And then that's not sufficient, though, Michael.
Yeah,
even though he may have publicly uttered heresy by words or deeds, that only proves the material element of the crime. There's another element of the crime that the Church has to prove, and that's the formal element. That is malice. That is whether the Pope is, in fact, with full knowledge and consent, choosing to deny or doubt what must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. That's the key here.
Yeah, pertinacity, essentially, correct? Yeah, and so maybe lay out that process. It's my understanding that the cardinals, or perhaps a group of bishops, would actually go and confront him twice based upon the admonition of St. Paul and Titus. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's excellent, Michael. That's exactly right. What St. Paul says to Titus, avoid the heretic after 2 warnings. And that's, again, from divine law, right? So this is coming from God himself. God is teaching us how the Church deals with heretics. Here, one bishop teaching another bishop. So the process would be, and this is what the consensus of all the theologians have held, there's never one that's departed from this. The Pope would have to be warned, as St. Paul admonishes Titus to do, and for the purpose of establishing whether he's truly pertinacious. Think about a Holy Father who is confronted by his brother bishops and cardinals with the gravest accusation of heresy. Okay, unless this man is truly obstinate and he's truly not a Catholic, one would think that the Catholic conscience would be startled and he would repent and conform himself, and God willing, at that point, he would be acquitted of the charge, right? But that process has to take place. If, in fact, he is obstinate and persists, at that point, St. Robert, the favorite apologist of the Sedevacantists, St. Robert says that the Pope, and I'm quoting him now, can be convicted of heresy. And St. Robert is still talking about this discretionary process where the Church establishes the facts. She proves that the elements of the crime of heresy have been proven, and it's a result of that proof that a guilty verdict is automatically rendered. because the Pope remains obstinate. But the church has not judged the Pope. She's only judged the facts, which have given the Pope an opportunity to correct himself. And if he doesn't, he then himself, the Pope himself, is judging himself as a heretic. So what St. Robert says is, after the discretionary process takes place, if in fact pertinacity is established, the Pope then would lose his office. He judges himself. John of St. Thomas called it an indirect judgment. And then St. Robert says, then the church can formally depose and punish the Pope, because guess what? He's no longer the Pope. He's no longer a member of the church. He's no longer Catholic. It's at that point, after the Pope judges himself by remaining obstinate in his heresy, the church then can exercise coercive authority over him because he's no longer Catholic. But that whole process demonstrates that the first see is judged by no one. The Pope has not been he has not been subject to an authoritative legal judgment or by the church. The church has simply established the facts, and he himself has cut himself from the body.
So this is, let me get this straight. This is essentially how you are going to avoid the charge of conciliarism. You're going to say that, well, he is no longer the Pope. He has deposed himself or has been deposed by God, a higher authority. So either he has indirectly deposed himself or God has deposed him. And therefore, it's not actually the church necessarily deposing him. It's more the church recognizing it. So it's not that the church exercises legal authority over him. They're just merely declaring something. Is that exactly accurate?
Correct, Michael. The discretionary judgment, we call it, and St. Robert calls it the antecedent judgment. It's the judgment that must precede the ipso facto loss of office. Okay, the Pope loses his office by the fact that he's a heretic that's been antecedently judged as such by the church. It's only then that the church can exercise authority over the man, because he's no longer the Pope. And St. Robert, and we mentioned this in our book, St. Robert says that, again, heresy is the one case where the Pope can be judged. He's referring to this discretionary judgment, but we know he's speaking about the Pope because he likens it to the inferior judging the superior. This is exactly what Bellarmine says. So Bellarmine's saying in this discretionary judgment process, it is the Pope that's being subjected to this process, even though he's not directly judged, by the church establishing the facts. There's, as John of St. Thomas says, there's an indirect judgment. And it's because of his obstinacy then that the church acts as the efficient cause for the loss of office. Christ would then come in, as we talk about in the book, and really be the efficient cause. The Christ that is the one who joins a man to the papacy. He's also the one working with the church who severs a man from the papacy. But this is the public judgment of the church. It's never a matter of private judgment.
Now, when you say the church, let's define this, because there's going to be questions here. How many of the cardinals are necessary, or how many bishops are necessary to make up what's called an imperfect ecumenical council? And if you could maybe define that for our viewers who aren't familiar with that term, how much could you maybe, get into some of those details for us?
Well, we certainly believe that not all of them would be required. The theologians have not said what kind of number it would be. We would think in God's providence it would be a majority, but even then we're not sure how the process would, because it's never happened before. What they've all said, though, is that an imperfect council could be called for purposes of rendering the discretionary judgment, that the church has a right in gathering the brother bishops around the world to determine if the vicar of Christ is no longer the vicar of Christ. And it's imperfect because the Pope is really not,
because he's not confirming it.
Now the subject of the inquiry. And, God forbid we can fathom a situation where the Pope may have adherents, that continue to support him. And then you might have this terrible case where it's not only the Pope who's cut off from the body, but also the bishops that are adhering to him, who's a heretic, who are also cut off. Who knows? These are theological speculations, but one thing is clear, is that a council, the brother bishops and the cardinals getting together, would have a right to judge facts. They have a right to determine whether Catholic truth the Holy Father has deviated from Catholic truth and revelation.
So why does it have to be the cardinals and the bishops? Why can't I, as a layman, just shoot them 2 emails and say you've been rebuked twice? now you're, I'm being a little absurd here, but
Yeah.
I'm asking because honestly, I have been told by individuals who are laymen who have emailed the Vatican and said that they have rebuked them twice and they feel that that's sufficient. Why is that insufficient? Why does it have to be a fraternal correction and not a filial correction?
Well, we listen to the consensus of the fathers who've written about that subject, and they all say that the men who are responsible for voting for him and being the dispositive cause of him being joined to the papacy must be the same men that act as the dispositive cause in removing him from the papacy.
Fair enough.
It only makes sense. This is, again, St. Thomas says, because we're dealing with a public matter in a public office, a public authority must be the judge. Thomas goes into this in the Summa, and he says anything other than a public judgment would be a judgment by usurpation. You'd be usurping lawful authority, and it's in the no place for any Catholic, of course, to do that.
Yeah.
No. It has no juridical effect anyway. We can't implement a juridical effect no matter how much we want to do that because we're not in Rome. But they could, the men who are in the Vatican and who've elected the Holy Father and who are in the Vatican, it's difficult to foresee it happening, but they could actually affect a physical deposition of a heretical pope. That's something that you and I can't do here in the United States. But again, these are theological questions that have been debated and speculated upon. But the bottom line is we know it is the church who must render this judgment.
And it honestly seems like they were trying to get the ball rolling here and get the process started when they sent Pope Francis the dubia. To me, that was them trying to find out, are you actually affirming heresy here? And then if he were to respond and reply, yes, I'm affirming heresy, then they would come and rebuke him twice and so on and kick off that process. That was the impression I got. I don't know if you want to maybe comment on that, but it seems like the whole thing has fizzled out. He's gone over 1,100 days and hasn't responded to the dubia. So it seems like it's not going anywhere. Do you maybe want to comment on that briefly?
I agree with you, Michael, and it is such a scandal that he hasn't responded to it. But I agree with your assessments. When Cardinal Burke said if he doesn't respond to the dubia, we would have to then issue a correction. Remember, the dubia wasn't an accusation of heresy. It was simply the cardinals, 4 of them at the time, seeking clarification. Okay. A warning is much graver than what they did. And that's why Cardinal Burke said, if he doesn't respond, we're going to issue a correction. That's what he meant. A correction is a formal warning. Holy Father, the church teaches X, you're teaching Y. You have to renounce Y. Otherwise, you're not consonant with X and you're a public heretic. We haven't gotten there. We thought that the table did. I did too, but that is yet to happen.
We've only seen a filial correction. Haven't seen any fraternal corrections. Any ideas, your personal theory on why haven't we seen cardinals and bishops move forward in this process and actually issue a fraternal correction of Pope Francis?
I think because of the diabolical influence that's in the Vatican. The fact that the church right now, and Our Lady warned about this. We have many things that we can refer to, even in so-called private revelations, but the church is under siege right now with the greatest demonic attack we've seen in church history. I think also this is a punishment for the Pope's failures to do what Our Lady commanded at Fatima. And, God in his infinite wisdom and providence is probably going to let this thing get a lot worse, to be frank, because we haven't seen a bishop dressed in white being executed yet, with many martyrs in the church and that whole scene. So
and what we saw essentially from John Paul II was the consecration of the world. That's not good enough, because it would be like me. It would be like me asking a priest to come over to my house, bless my home, and what the priest just does is he shoots me an email and says, "You know what? I'm blessing the entire world, and that includes your home. So you're good. Your house has been blessed." That's not good enough. You have to
get that logic.
and sprinkle the holy water and do all that good stuff to my actual place and consecrate it specifically. And so I would agree with you that actually has not been done.
I would agree with Sister Lucia, who said it wasn't done.
Yeah, and it seems problematic because it would appear to be that Pope John the 23rd opened up the letter of the third secret, read it, and said, "This doesn't apply to our time." And shortly thereafter, he calls the Second Vatican Council, and the bottom fell out. So there does seem to be some coincidence there. Maybe if you want to comment a little bit about that before we move forward.
Well, I've written about this. I have a book called The Catechism of Fatima, and I go through each pope, what they did, what they didn't do. In fact, in the book, I actually document the dates that they read the third secret. And John the 23rd read it twice. Same Paul VI, John Paul II. We have the actual dates they read the text. And I speculate, I thought about what John the 23rd said when he said, "This doesn't apply to my pontificate," assuming that that's in fact what he said.
Right.
I thought to myself, what could he possibly be referring to? If the third secret were revealing some type of planetary catastrophe, right? And I think it might be revealing that. But if it revealed some type of conflagration like that, John the 23rd couldn't say that doesn't apply to my pontificate because he wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I have concluded what John the 23rd was referring to was an act of the church, that there would be a future act of the church, of the bishops, calling a council, changing the mass, something like that, where he could look at that and say, that's an ecclesiastical event that Our Lady's warning about, but that doesn't apply to my pontificate because I ain't going to do that. You see, that's why I'm convinced, as Father Brunner was and others, that the third secret does warn of the Second Vatican Council and the new mass.
Yeah, and before I move on and touch, back to what we were talking about at Sedevacantism, let me follow up on something here. What would you say to those who say, well, the third secret has been revealed in full? Would you say that, no, that's not true, that there's perhaps a part 3B that hasn't been revealed, which would be Our Lady's interpretation of the secret? Would you go with that theory, or do you have something else?
No, that's right. Obviously, when you look at Lucia's memoirs, there's another text. The Vatican has admitted, and even Cardinal Bertone even showed two separate envelopes that held two different texts. He did on national television in 2007 on Porta Porta. We know there are two texts. We know that Our Lady wouldn't give this obscure vision without explaining it to her children.
Right.
So there is a suppressed text.
Because she explained the other two secrets, but here we don't have an explanation, which is very curious.
Right.
That other letter
if we look at Lucia's memoirs, she refers to another document. There is another document. Bertoni's effectively acknowledged that there is another document, and yet why haven't they published it? So there is an explanation of the vision, and that's what's been suppressed. It explains what's going on, I believe, right now in the church, where the situation where we have two bishops in white. One's the Pope, one isn't the Pope. The world is getting more evil and more evil, as the generations pass. And of course, what Our Lady predicted even in the 20th century, with the ending of World War I, but the beginning of World War II, a prediction of Pius XI, who the young children didn't even know that was a future pope. All of these predictions have come to pass, but the ultimate prediction in the third secret and this vision that she's given us has not yet come to pass. We believe it is a conditional chastisement, depending upon whether the Pope finally executes her command to consecrate the nation of Russia in union with all the Catholic bishops to her Immaculate Heart.
But even if he doesn't, in the end, her Immaculate Heart would triumph. So
it would triumph after the consecration, though. A consecration is the condition of the triumph. It's not going to happen without the consecration.
So apart from consecration, this will not get any better. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's why I believe it's only going to get worse until Russia's consecrated.
What would you say to those who said that perhaps those who were around Sister Lucia indicated that what she meant by Russia converting was a conversion to Orthodoxy rather than Catholicism? Have you gone into that any?
Well, we've gone to that in great depth. That's an insult to Jesus Christ, our Lord, who established the Catholic Church as the only means of salvation. Obviously, Our Lady wasn't telling people that the Russian Orthodox have to convert to a heretical sect, which is going to cause them to lose their souls. That's idiotic.
I got you. Yeah. Now let me also ask you just a little bit more about the third secret before we kind of return to where we were. When it comes to the third secret, those who have read it seem to indicate this was very, very there was going to be a massive fallout. There was going to be a major issue with apostasy. It seems like it indicated there was going to be massive liturgical problems. There was going to be issues from the top down. Now, what we got with the third secret doesn't indicate any of that. I don't see any. So people who have read this thing came with interpretations of it, or came with the explanations and descriptions of it that do not seem to fit with what we did get from Bertone in the Vatican. So could you maybe speak a little bit more to what do we think was really the fullness of the secret? What all does it really say to the best of our knowledge?
Well, the clerics who have read it have already told us. I mean, Cardinal Carte, for example, said the secret reveals apostasy will begin at the top. And I have quote after quote after quote from the bishops of Fatima, Cardinal Carte, Cardinal Odi, Pope Benedict himself, when he was cardinal, again says the Fatima and Akita are the same. Well, what happened to Our Lady's revelations in Akita? Cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops opposing bishops, chaos in the church, even fire falling from the sky. Where's that? I mean, where's that in the current Fatima message? So, Michael, you're exactly right. There's nothing in the first two secrets that remotely address apostasy in the church, and yet we are living that apostasy in the church, and the apostasy is even greater and more widespread now in 2019 than it was in 1965. I mean, it's accelerating at a rapid pace. Yeah. So the speculations are bearing themselves out in our reality.
Yeah, it seems to be getting worse under Pope Francis. I don't think anybody really imagined that this would really be taking place, especially after the Amazon Synod. Now, don't get me wrong. Things have been really bad even before the Amazon Synod. But after the Amazon Synod, I think we have seen how far papal fallibility can really be pushed, how far the envelope of the fallibility aspect of the human ecclesial part of the church can really be pushed. I would have never thought that you could have actual idolatry taking place under the sanction and supervision of the Pope, but it seems that that was exactly the case of what took place. Could you maybe comment a little bit about your thoughts on the Amazon Synod, what took place there with Pachamama? What are your impressions on that?
Well, I knew it was possible because it happened in 1986 under the pontificate of John Paul II, when he called pagans to Assisi to pray to their false gods, which was a violation of the first commandment. Other than hatred of God, that's the worst sin one could commit. He did it again in 91, 92, 3, 4, on and on. Benedict did it twice. Francis has done it.
It seems worse with Francis because this is taking place in Rome. Assisi was, in Assisi, bad enough as it was. But also, I didn't see really anybody actually bow down to a statue in front of the Pope. I know they had a Buddha on a Catholic altar, but I don't think it was in the presence of the Pope. Correct me if I'm wrong. But here you have with Pachamama, in front of the Pope, people were bowing down in the Vatican gardens in front of it. So it seems to be even worse than what took place with
one could argue it's worse. I don't know if the Pope himself bowed down in idolatry to the Pachamama idol, which is exactly what it was, a demon idol. I don't know if he did that, but do we hear him issuing any corrections about it? Do we hear him condemning the practice? He sanctioned it. He's culpable for it, whether he worshipped or not. He's tacitly approved it or formally approved it one way or another. But it's the continuation of this. And again, I wasn't planning on talking about Fatima at all tonight. But again, it's all about that. Until Our Lady's requests are heeded, God in his anger is going to permit this to get even worse and worse. Brothers and sisters, we haven't seen the worst yet. Okay, it's accelerating, but it's not as bad as it's going to get.
Yeah, and sorry about that. I didn't mean to get too much off topic there, but that was definitely get into some interesting stuff that's been on my mind.
It's natural to refer to Fatima. I mean, it's just
absolutely. I think it's very, very important to look into that, because I hear a lot of people that are still skeptical of it, and I can understand that, but I think that there really does appear to be some interesting timing behind the event of the Fatima revelation and what took place as far as the crisis in the church. If somebody can offer a better theory, I'm all ears. But that seems.
Yeah, I would, Michael. I would just want to mention too, and this just came to my mind. Our Lady appeared at Fatima in 1917. She formally gave the command to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart in 1929.
Mhm.
And we know about the comparison between that and our Lord and his command to Louis XIV and consecrating France to his Sacred Heart. And he gave 100 years, and his son and the grandson didn't do it, and before he was finally stripped of his authority, and the revolution took place. So God only knows. But I'll tell you what, 2029, which would be the 100-year anniversary of Our Lady's command, is not far off. 2020 is right around the corner. We have bishops in white. We have apostasy widespread, idolatry in the Vatican, the worst homosexual and pederast crisis we've ever imagined, financial scandal, upheaval, you name it, and the 100th anniversary just 9 years away. It's certainly something to think about and to pray about.
Sure. And perhaps we could talk about that in a little bit more, but let's get back to the issue of Sedevacantism and also heresy. Let me ask you, as far as heresy is concerned, and specifically with Pope Francis, I gather from what you just said earlier, in order to be a formal heretic, there has to be the judgment of the church. The church has to recognize that there's formal heresy being taking place. But in order for there to be material heresy, is that something that you and I as laymen can see in a cleric, that we can determine, okay, what he just uttered is material heresy?
Yeah, but that judgment would not result in any juridical effect and wouldn't even prove that he's guilty of the crime, because the material element is one element, the formal is another. Sure, we can say as Catholics, we have the right, and to those who are equipped have even the duty to point out that the Pope is uttering material heresies. Absolutely. And through our works and prayers, hopefully ultimately to get the people who have the authority to confront the Pope about it. I wanted to mention, though, Michael, that when we talk about the two ways, remember I said Bellarmine said there were two ways to leave the church. One is openly leaving the church. The other is being cut off by the church's judgment. We've talked about the church's judgment. We also recognize the other way, that if a pope or a cleric were to openly leave the church, for example, and join another religion, okay, the theologians talk about that actually being potentially sufficient enough where the external bond of the church is severed. Remember that a Catholic is a member of the church by virtue of baptism, but there's the external profession of faith, there's governance, and there's the sacraments, okay? So the theologians talk about if there is an open defection, okay, then the cleric would have severed that social bond that united them to the church. And we could maybe hypothesize that in such a case, a pope or a cleric would lose their office. Now, this has been codified in canon law. Bellarmine, who taught hundreds of years ago, said either openly leave or cut off by the church's judgment. The church codifies this by calling heresy either heresy by a notoriety, by law, or by fact. So if the heresy is notorious by law, it's referring to the legal judgment. If it's notorious by fact, it's referring to one who publicly leaves. But even in the case of heresy as notorious by fact, if you look at canon law, if a cleric were to somehow defect, a warning is still required under the current code of canon law. They have to be warned about the gravity of the situation and to determine, again, if there's malice, right? Because there are other elements that possibly could excuse a cleric. Is it senility? Is it drunkenness? Is it diabolical possession? Is it ignorance? Okay, there is a benefit of the doubt here. And so even in the case of notorious by fact, the church would have something to say about it. But I want to be clear that it's not only this judicial process that I described, but Bellarmine acknowledges another way. But I want to say one more thing about that too. Robert Bellarmine, I think, and from what we've read, held just about the highest standards of holding someone as a heretic by notoriety of fact. He talks about Pope Marcellinus. Now, Pope Marcellinus evidently offered incense to idols, to the demon god of Jupiter. And when you read Bellarmine's writing, Bellarmine says that that's a true factual account, and he substantiates it with other writings and documents. And you know what Bellarmine said? Even though he did commit a public act of apostasy, Bellarmine said he still didn't separate himself from the church in doing so. So even in Bellarmine's judgment, he wasn't a heretic by a notoriety of fact. Bellarmine acknowledges what has been codified in canon law. There may be other excuses. So again, it's about the church determining whether there's malice.
So what's going on here, and correct me if I'm wrong, a pope could sever himself from the invisible bonds of unity, faith, hope, and love, faith, hope, and charity. He could sever himself through that act of, say, sacrificing to a pagan god. That does not necessarily prove that he has severed himself from the visible bond of the church until the church declares it. Is that what you're saying?
You're exactly right in that there is a distinction between the invisible bonds and the visible bonds, or the external bonds. A formal heretic sins mortally against the faith, and he does lose the interior virtue of faith, hope, and charity that was infused in his soul at baptism.
Yeah.
But if he doesn't sever the external bond, that is, when we talk about the public profession of the faith, what that means, Michael, is that he publicly follows the church as the infallible rule of faith. He has not publicly chosen another rule. If the Pope were to come out and say, I am no longer Catholic, I am now joining the Lutheran sect, and who knows, maybe he might. He hasn't done that yet. But if he would do that, he would be renouncing the ecclesiastical magisterium, as Bio says, and choosing another rule of faith. That's what we mean by the profession of faith. This is very important for our Sedevacantist and Francis rejecting friends. A Catholic does not have to articulate the minutiae of the Catholic faith with perfect clarity in order to retain the social bond of the church. It doesn't refer to a Catholic's ability to understand and articulate the faith. Catholics can make heretical statements all the time. We've probably made some over our lifetimes, right? We've said something that was perhaps in our youth and ignorance contrary to the church. It doesn't refer to that. It refers to those who still hold the church as the infallible rule of faith. You know, St. Pius X had a case where he had a judge where a Catholic family was attending Protestant services. They weren't practicing their Catholic faith at all, and yet they held themselves to be Catholic. Just like when Francis was asked about his teaching on communism or whatever it was, he says, I believe this is what the church teaches. This is the authentic doctrinal development of the church. He hasn't renounced the church as the rule of faith, even though he's deviated materially from the teachings of the church. But he hasn't severed the external bond or the social bond by choosing another rule of faith, okay? That's why he can't be considered a heretic by a notoriety of fact, because he hasn't severed the external bond, even though, as you said, Michael, internally, he may have lost the virtue of faith and is a formal heretic internally.
Sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean they lose their office. Otherwise, bishops would be losing their office every day, probably. Unfortunately, bishops and priests. So, yeah, that we would have chaos at that point. Could you maybe point to an instance? I don't know if maybe you want to comment on specifics, but if you don't, that's okay. We can go on to something else. But could you maybe point to a specific example where Pope Francis has taught, at least materially, something that appears to be heresy?
Where do you begin? I mean, if in fact he said that souls are annihilated,
right,
that's heretical. If in fact he said that hell doesn't exist, that's heretical. Those are dogmas that have been defined by church councils.
But we can't prove that because it's indirect through scalpel.
Right.
Is there anything objective we could really point to?
If he's saying the indissolubility of marriage can be broken, there's any number of things that may rise to the level of material heresy, and I wouldn't deny that. I'm not here to defend him. I mean, I think, materially he is now. Here's another point, though. We don't call Catholics material heretics. And the reason why that is a material heretic is not a member of the church. Okay. A material heretic, though, doesn't hold the church as the rule of faith. They have another rule of faith, but we call them material heretics because they're not culpable for that. They're somehow ignorant. Only God knows that soul. But just to clarify terminology, we can't call Francis a material heretic because he's still a member of the church. And a material heretic, the best way to think about it is a material heretic is a baptized non-Catholic, okay? Where a formal heretic, I like to think of it as a baptized ex-Catholic, one who did at one time hold the church as the rule of faith and then departed from her. That becomes a manifest heretic. And if a cleric, would be warned and would be judged accordingly.
Yeah. Now, can you maybe speak to the issue of occult heresy? What exactly is that for anybody who sees that term come up? If they pick up Bellarmine, they start looking into what you're saying, they might come up across that term. Could you maybe define some of these things for us? Occult heresy, manifest heretic. What do those things mean?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, Michael, because this is another thing that the Sedevacantists have completely missed.
Mhm.
They believe, and those who reject Francis's pontificate, again, which is a mortal sin against the faith,
Mhm.
they believe that if heresy is manifested in public, whether by words or deeds, they conclude that because the act is public, that the nature of the act then makes the heresy public, and if you're a public heretic, you're no longer a member of the church. That's not true.
Mhm.
Occult heresy could include public acts. We
Mhm.
see this and we write about this in our book. The latest, I think, came from Cardinal Bio, who said, so long as the heresy has not been judged notorious by the church, it remains occult.
So
That
even if it's out in the external, it's
correct.
still occult. Okay.
Occult heresy either could be heresy that's in secret, in the heart,
Mhm.
or it could be heresy that's in the public, but it hasn't risen to the level of notorious because the person hasn't either openly left the church or been judged a heretic by the church. Absent one of those two ways of losing office because you're a manifest heretic, the heresy is necessarily occult. It's
Yeah.
necessarily occult. So if you want to call Francis an occult heretic, I would prefer to say that his heresies are material. And if you want to call him an occult heretic, then that's what he is. But he can't be a formal heretic because he's still a member of the church.
Okay. So now what would you say to those? Because we had an individual on the show not too long ago, Mark Bonacore, and he was talking about how it is possible that perhaps Pope Francis still holds some kind of office when it comes to the papacy, some kind of passive role. What would you say to those who say that maybe the papacy has been split in two? And that's not exactly what Mark was saying, by the way. I'm just asking for individuals who say that. What would you say about someone who says the papacy has been split between an active and a passive role, or that Pope Francis isn't Pope at all because he was apostate whenever he was elected, or the St. Gallen's Mafia made it entirely invalidated, so he isn't Pope? Pope Benedict is still the Pope. What would you say to those things?
Well, there's many things you can say to those things. First of all, the Pope is Pope by virtue of his universal jurisdiction. That's what makes him Pope. And of course, you can't have partial jurisdiction. He's either Pope or he's not. Because he has supreme and plenary jurisdiction over the entire church, you can't say he kind of holds the papacy or only holds some part of the papacy. That's impossible. That's not the way Christ set up the office. He either has supreme jurisdiction as the Pope or he's not. The other thing I would say to that is this doctrine of universal and peaceful acceptance, which again, there's a consensus of theologians. In fact, they say this is a dogmatic fact. We can point to papal teachings on this. Martin V, for example, requiring one to acknowledge the current successor of Christ is in fact the successor of Peter, which is a matter of faith. It's a matter of divine faith. And those who would reject a man who has been, when he's elected, peacefully and universally accepted by the church, the Cardinals, the electorate, the bishops, the moral unanimity of the faithful, which is the case of Pope Francis, means he is infallibly the Pope. In fact, the theologians talk about this acceptance of the faithful being not a cause, but an effect of the fact that he's truly the Pope. And because the acceptance is an effect of the fact that he is Pope, we can be certain then that all of the conditions necessary for him to gain the papacy have been satisfied, which means he was baptized, right? He wasn't a heretic. There was no impediment to him gaining the office. He was baptized. He was a member of the church. You can't be a head over what's something you're not a member. And so universal and peaceful acceptance is what we would call a dogmatic fact that has to be held with divine faith, with ecclesiastical faith. It's what the church teaches as part of the church's secondary object of infallibility, if you will. And again, part of the reason, Michael, you asked why we wrote the book is to help people understand these grave things and correct their errors. Because if you reject this person as Pope, you're committing a mortal sin against the faith. You've lost the virtue of faith, and by losing the virtue of faith, you've lost what? You've lost the virtue of charity. This is why we see all the bitter fruits in Sedevacantism, the chaos that's going on, is because these people have lost faith, and hence they've lost charity.
Yeah. Now, when you were speaking about this is one of the reasons why you wrote the book, what would be the primary biggest problem that you see with Sedevacantism that you address in the book, or have been just addressing, after the fact? What is the biggest issue that you've noticed?
Formal Catholics have left the church, and they've condemned themselves. Mm-hmm. They've defected from the Holy Roman Catholic Church, outside of which there's no salvation. What could be graver than that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, even as lay people, we have a duty to witness, to evangelize, and to try to explain to them why they're in error, because this is no small matter. Mm-hmm. I mean, this starts with questioning, okay? But there is a progression that we see here. After the questioning starts, then they start making private judgments, maybe talking to friends about this, okay? We've seen this in stages with many people. Even some of them are friends or former friends. Then their judgments become harsher, and they become public judgments, okay? Then they begin to speak publicly about it, and then start trying to convince people to their position. You know where this ultimately leads, Michael? It ultimately leads them not of only leaving the church, but actually declaring that the church has defected. Mm-hmm. Think about that. This is where Sedevacantism ultimately leads to what we would call ecclesiavacantism, a vacant church, an empty church, a defected church. Because if you ask these people where the Catholic Church is, they can't tell you. They will only say it's those who hold the true faith. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? That's exactly what the Protestants say. Congratulations, you now have a Protestant definition of the church. Mm-hmm. They believe that the church is ultimately defected. And this is where they end up, and it's a dead end. The church hasn't defected. The church is going through her bitter passion, just like our Lord. The church will rise again someday. We'll talk about why, Fatima. But the church will rise again. But this is grave, the fact that we have Catholics, former Catholics, who've left the church, who've defected from the church, and are going to lose their salvation. Because as the church teaches, you must be subject to the Holy Father to save your soul. They ain't subject to him. They've left him. They've left Holy Mother Church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, what would you also say is the additional to the fact that individuals are leaving the Catholic faith formally? Would you say that there are other concerns as well, other theological concerns that you've seen? Maybe could you touch on some of those? And I'm going to jump to some chat questions here too while you respond to that. I'm going to start.
Well, it's the influence that they're having on other people. Okay, we now see these questions bubbling in people who really used to be quite orthodox in their belief and systematic in the way they approach things. What I see is an emotionalism that takes place here. And now we get away from reason and logic and theology, and now we're dealing with the emotions. And we should be gutturally upset about some of the things that are going on in Rome, but I almost see that the emotions are overtaking reason and logic, and that can have a really broad impact on people. And this is one of the things we're trying to combat right now as we fight this battle.
Yeah. I can.
My battery's dying.
Oh, okay. Do you want to get it connected? You can come right back. Are you there, Mr. Salza? Hello. Testing 1 2 3. Mr. Salza, you there? I think we may have just lost connection from him. I know I was losing some connection too, so I'm not even sure if you guys are hearing me. If y'all can maybe respond to me in the chat. Are y'all still hearing me by any chance? It looks like it's still streaming on my end, but I know I was having some connectivity issues when I just tried to type into chat here. Let them back on. Let me add them back to the stream here. Let's see. All right. I'm trying to add you right back now, Mr. Salza. Give it just a second here. Mr. Salza, can you hear me? I can see your video feed. I can't hear you yet. Maybe if you can adjust the settings on the actual phone. since you're using your phone there. Yeah, you may want to make sure to enable the audio if you can hear me. See if you can turn on the audio settings. Hold on, let me see here. Let me. Are you able to hear me now? I can see you moving, but I can't hear you yet. And I have you unmuted on my end, so I think it might be some kind of setting on yours. Yeah, I can't hear anything. There usually is a setting there at the bottom. I ordinarily don't use a phone to integrate into this one, so I'm not exactly sure what it looks like on your end. Let me see if I can maybe try it with you. Y'all bear with us here. We're working through some technical difficulties. Let me also. Is there a way that I could maybe call you on my phone and hold that speaker up, and maybe we could at least get audio through that way? I don't see Mr. Salza moving there, so might have lost signal. Sorry, you guys. I think we're having some issues with his microphone. I know that it's a new program, so we're still trying to figure it out. Let's see. Tell him to look for the microphone pick and see if there's a line through it. Mr. Salza, if you can hear us, there should be a picture of a microphone on your phone there. See if you see that by any chance. Yeah, I still can't hear anything. Let me maybe try giving you a call. See if we can at least patch audio through that way. Let's see.
Hey, Michael, I can hear you.
Okay, well, let's try to do it like this, because for some reason the audio isn't coming through, but I can see you visually here, and we could probably hear you through the microphone pretty well. Could you hear me well?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I might be able to hear you. Program. Try saying something again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, it's working now. Very, very good. That works a lot better than trying through the phone. I wanted to get some live call-ins, but there wouldn't be a way that I could put the caller on the phone and they would still be able to hear you. So we're gonna have to stick to chat questions on this one. If y'all can go ahead and start sending us some chat questions, I'll start posting them now. So go ahead and start putting them in the stream and we can jump to them. Let's see. Well, here's one question. Let me pull it up. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, Mr. Salza. This is from Semper Te Amabo. He says, "Is anyone on earth a manifest heretic?" So I guess you would have to try to address the fact that is this something that we can determine in anyone as laity? Or do we always need the judgment of the church to determine that anybody is a manifest heretic?
Well, if we're talking about a cleric, unless the cleric has been judged a heretic by the church or has openly left the church and has been judged a notorious heretic by fact, then the answer is no, at least I'm not aware of any clerics. Are there other Catholics who have left the church and are manifest heretics? I can think of a few that I personally know. But again, they don't hold office in the church and hence aren't subject to any type of jurisdiction. See, so when we're talking about clerics and we're talking about jurisdiction, okay, as long as for example, a bishop holds his see peacefully and is tolerated as a bishop and hasn't been cut off by the church's judgment and claims and says that the church is his rule of faith, he's not a manifest heretic, even though he may have uttered heresies, material heresies in public. Okay. This one, it just moved on me. Let me return to it. This is from Thomas Comerford. He says, what does Mr. Salza make of the Second Council of Constantinople in light of all this? Is this council akin to an imperfect ecumenical council? I don't know if you maybe want to comment on that. I don't know if he's referring to the second or the fourth. I don't recall the facts of the second, but when we talk about the imperfect council, it is a gathering of the world's bishops, or a moral unanimity of the world's bishops, to discuss a matter and to establish facts about a matter. And as Bellarmine and Suarez and some of the other theologians say, this can be done in the case of heresy, particularly heresy of a potentially, heretical pope. But he'd have to be more specific about his question.
This one is from Vatican Catholic. He says, is Joe Biden a Catholic who professes the true faith or a manifest heretic? It's kind of related to the one that we had.
Right. Well, it's interesting about Joe Biden. Joe Biden claims that he doesn't believe abortion personally, but he holds it politically. Okay. So he has deviated from the Catholic faith. But what did Joe Biden just say last week? He said, I'm a practicing Catholic. And so Joe Biden would be considered a member of the church, not a manifest heretic, even though perhaps because of his position on abortion, he's committed a mortal sin against the faith. He may have spiritually severed himself from the church, but he hasn't legally severed himself from the church. Even though he was denied Holy Communion, he hasn't been excommunicated. So there hasn't been an ecclesiastical judgment of his heresy as manifest. So as bad as he is, the technical answer legally is that he still remains a member of the church. He's not a manifest heretic.
Okay. This is related to one of the questions I asked you, but we'll go ahead and reiterate it again. What constitutes as the church when judging a pope to be a heretic? Does this refer to a council, the College of Cardinals, etc.?
Yes. And so we talk about this in our book. And again, I'm referring to what the theologians have said. These aren't our opinions. A couple things. One, they've said that the warnings which would precede the discretionary judgment, these charitable warnings, would likely come from the Cardinals, the College of Cardinals, who elected the Pope, but that an imperfect council would be the world's bishops. Okay, so it would be a gathering of the world's bishops who then would be involved in the discretionary judgment of whether, in fact, the Pope were guilty of the crime of heresy, establishing the material and formal elements and then convicting him of the crime. So it would be a gathering of an imperfect ecumenical council of the world's bishops, according to the theologians.
Yeah. This one is from Mark. He says, could Francis do anything that would cause you to accept the Sedevacantism position?
Yeah, he could be cut off by the church's judgment and be declared a heretic.
Okay, good. Let's see, thumbing through some more here. Some of them appear to be redundant, so bear with me here. Does Pope Francis specifically profess heresy? What would you say to them?
Yes. If in fact he said, and some of this is hearsay, and as a lawyer I'm sensitive to that, right? But if in fact he said that, as we talked about, souls are annihilated, there is no hell, or hell is empty, that's heretical. And that would be the material element of the crime of heresy. But as we said, even those utterances, even if they're in public, are deemed to be occult. They're deemed to be occult until the church judges that they're notorious. Okay, but before that happens, he would only be considered an occult heretic.
This one also from Vatican Catholic. He says cardinals have no authority to warn a pope whatsoever. Their warnings could be no more canonical in that regard than a taxi driver. So you're getting this as far as cardinals having the ability to warn the pope. Would you phrase it as them actually have an authority, or would you say that no, this isn't a matter of authority?
Well, they must disagree with St. Paul then. Who instructed Titus after 2 admonitions, avoid the heretic. I mean, bishops can warn bishops. Bishops can even warn the Holy Father. But remember, this person is confusing juridical warnings that would have some type of coercive power over the Pope versus warnings in charity. We're simply talking about fraternal correction here, okay? Are you telling me that the Pope's inferiors can fraternally correct the Pope? Of course not. You don't understand Catholic teaching. This is all over Catholic moral theology. I mean, St. Thomas talks all the time about how an inferior can fraternally correct a superior. Why? Because the superior has the graver position. He's in the graver danger. And that's why not only can the cardinals warn the Pope, they have a duty and an obligation to warn the Pope, because the Pope's in the greater danger.
Okay. This one is from Sensus Fidei. He says, why are Sedevacantists the heretics, even though we haven't been declared heretics, but your popes get the pass and can be considered Catholics no matter what they say or do?
Simple answer, because you've openly departed from the church. According to St. Bellarmine, you haven't been formally cut off by the church's judgment, but there's another way, and that's openly leaving the church. You no longer are Catholic because you choose to follow another rule, your own rule, or rule of private judgment. You don't follow the ecclesiastical magisterium. You've severed the social bond with the church. In fact, you say that the church has defected. You don't even believe there's a Catholic church. The Sedevacantists that debate this say all the time, the church is defected. The church no longer exists. And so Sedevacantists would be considered heretics because they've openly departed from the church.
This one is from Victus. He says, is it permissible to submit completely to the magisterium of Francis?
No, we have a duty to recognize and resist him. To the extent he teaches what the church teaches, of course we follow it. But if he deviates from that, we have to resist it. I mean, we have to know our faith. That's different than what the Sedevacantists do. The Sedevacantists don't recognize and resist. They simply don't recognize. They don't recognize that this is the Holy Father and that there is a magisterium. Some of them even say that we only have a magisterium of the pasts, right? So there's a difference there. We submit to the magisterium and to the Holy Father, and if he deviates, then we resist. It's as simple as that. This is what's been going on for 2,000 years. This isn't the first pope who's deviated from the faith.
This one is also from Mark. He's asking about Pope Paul IV. He says, did Pope Paul IV believe Sedevacantism was possible and that Catholics were allowed to recognize undeclared heretics sometimes without an imperfect council when he wrote Cum ex Apostolatus?
Absolutely not. And we talk about this in our book, and we actually cite canonists who lived at the time that Paul IV wrote Cum ex Apostolatus. And when he talked about heretics and that being an impediment to elections and so forth, he was talking about when the heresy was formally judged by the church. It was not by private judgment. Again, we go into this in detail in True or False Pope, but he is referring to heresy that was formally adjudicated as such by the church, not by private judgment.
This one is from Quoque Fam. He says, Sedevacantism essentially falls into the same fallacy as neoconservative Catholics, right? That is an overemphasis on papal infallibility. Would you agree with that?
Boy, that's a very good analysis. We do agree with that. We talk about that in the book. You know, there's this error of excess and error of defect, you know, and some of these people can be excessive insofar as they believe anything the Pope says that can be, that is infallible, and that's not the case. So the Sedevacantists conclude that since everything the Pope teaches must be infallible, and since what he's teaching is heretical, he can't be the Pope. Whereas the Neos say, well, because everything the Pope teaches is infallible, what he's teaching must be true, and we have to follow it. But that's not the case. There's always, this mean between the error of excess and defect. And the truth is, when the Pope adheres to tradition, we believe it, and when he doesn't, we don't. But he's still the Pope.
This one has essentially been answered before, but let's go ahead and reiterate it. If Francis is in formal heresy at this time, then do you agree that God does not recognize him as holding the papal office based on cum ex and satis cognitum? Would you say that he's in formal heresy? I know you spoke about that earlier. Could you maybe explain why he's not?
Okay, well, we have to then talk about the distinction between, material heresy and formal heresy. If, in fact, the Pope has committed the sin of heresy, okay, not the public and notorious act of heresy by which he would lose his office, but only the sin of heresy. For example, if he privately denies the divinity of Jesus Christ, okay, he would be a formal heretic, and he would sever his spiritual bond with the church. Remember, we talked about there being visible bonds and invisible bonds, that is, exterior bonds and interior bonds. The supernatural virtue of faith is one of the three interior bonds that unite man spiritually to the church, or as some of the theologians have said, to the soul of the church. And again, if the Pope or any Catholic would sin against the faith by denying or doubting a truth that they have to believe with divine and Catholic faith, they would be spiritually severed from the church. They would be in mortal sin. And if they die in that state, they would go to hell. But that doesn't mean that they are a heretic in the external forum. Again, they'd have to formally sever their profession of faith, that is to the magisterium, and choose another rule of faith for them to be considered a formal heretic according to the church's judgment. They certainly may be interiorly by the judgment of God, having sinned against the faith, but not externally according to the public judgment of the church, again, unless the church judges their heresy as notorious.
Semper asks, should one resist an ecumenical council such as Vatican II?
To the extent that Vatican II deviates from the faith, we have a duty to resist it. We have a duty to resist all teachings that deviate from the faith. What we know about Vatican II, according to what Paul VI even said, is that it defined no dogma. Of course, it defined no dogma. Therefore, we're not bound to believe what the council taught with divine and Catholic faith. It didn't define doctrine. Okay, so now our consent becomes conditional. It certainly came from the authentic magisterium, but it didn't come from the infallible magisterium because it didn't doctrinally teach matters of faith or morals which we must believe with divine and Catholic faith. At least it reiterated some of those teachings, but it didn't de novo teach any new doctrines. And hence we would not be bound then to follow those things that would deviate from the traditional doctrine of the church, such as ecumenism and religious liberty and so forth. But Vatican II is quite a different animal. Okay, again, it didn't define doctrine. It didn't condemn error. So it really is in a unique category by itself. And we don't want to be disrespectful, right, to the bishops or the church. But the reality is they themselves have said that its level of teaching is on a different level. And it's not like a dogmatic ecumenical council.
Very, very true. Fair enough. He asked another follow-up question. This is a very good one. Are the Orthodox, that is the Eastern Orthodox, outside the church or in partial communion with the church? Could you maybe comment on that?
Well, when we're talking about the external forum, they're outside the church. There's really no such thing as partial communion, even though I know it's the Vatican II speak of the modernists. You're either in communion with the church or you're not, right? That is not to say, and again, we go back to the principles that we were talking about, Michael, the interior and exterior bonds. The Orthodox do not have the exterior bonds of unity to the church. Therefore, they're necessarily outside the church because they're not members of the church. They don't choose the Catholic Church as the infallible rule of faith, nor are they subject to the church's governments or participate in the church's sacraments. And even if they claim that they do, they certainly don't have the church as the rule of faith or are subject to the church's government. So they at least don't have two of the three external bonds. Whether some of them have the interior virtue of faith is known to God alone, right? We can't judge that because the church doesn't judge internals. I suppose there could be the case where there may be a person here or there who is ignorant of the church's teaching, who we would call a material heretic, because they're not culpable for not being in the Catholic Church and may in fact have supernatural faith. And if they're not in a state of mortal sin, even perfect charity even could save their souls. It's a theological, theoretical possibility. But again, understand the distinction between those who are outside the church as regards to the external forum and those who may be united to the soul of the church, the spiritual element of the church interiorly.
Okay. I'm trying to see if I can weed through some of the comments and find some more questions here. Bear with me for just a second. Trying to get one. If y'all want to, we're wrapping up the questions here, y'all. So if y'all want to send some last ones, go ahead and do it. All right, here we go. Well, from Cherry Blossom, if Francis is professing heresy, as you say, which cardinals or bishops are not professing heresy right now, even though they believe in Vatican II? Well, I'm not exactly sure. seems kind of odd the way they phrase that. If Francis is professing
Yeah.
heresy, as you say, which cardinals or bishops are not professing heresy right now, even though believe it?
First of all, I said if Francis has said these things, then I would conclude that he made heretical statements. I'm not accusing him because I don't know if he said them or not. But I would concede if, in fact, he said that there's no hell, that's heretical, and he made a materially heretical statement. Which cardinals or bishops are not professing heresy? Well, you're asking me to prove a negative? I don't know. I haven't heard Cardinal Burke say anything heretical.
Yeah.
I don't know if Bishop Athanasius Schneider does. I doubt it. So I don't know what you mean by that.
Yeah.
But whether they have made any heretical statements in public or not would only say that they made statements that would be occult heresy. It would never be considered notorious or formal heresy unless it was judged as such by the church.
All right, I'm going to take just a couple more. This is from Daniel Brooks. He says, if we find ourselves in Sedevacantism, how does the church recover the chair of Peter? Now, I know you don't affirm this, but when you've spoken to Sedevacantists, have they offered any kind of good reply on how they would recover the chair of Peter from that position?
Well, they've offered a reply, but it's certainly not a good one. The only thing they can say is God must somehow figure it out. And maybe Christ himself comes down from heaven and elects the Pope, right? I mean,
have you ever heard of a prophecy? There was something that I was reading a while back where there was a prophecy that Peter himself would appoint a new Pope. Have you heard of that before?
I'm not aware of the church ever approving such a prophecy. I've heard chatter about it, but I'm not aware that it's an approved prophecy. But we can't ever find ourselves in sedevacante unless we're referring to an interregnum between the election of one pope after the death or resignation of another, right? If we're talking about a pope having been elected and immediately upon election being accepted by the church, the cardinals, the entire world's bishops, and a moral unanimity of the Catholic faithful, then there is no sedevacante. It can't be. It can't be. Therefore, we have the means by which to elect the next pope because we have the cardinals in the Vatican, who are, by the way, are members of the Pope, the Church, just like Francis is.
Okay. This one's an interesting one. We hear a lot about the errors of Vatican II popes not being binding or authoritative, as you just mentioned. Is it permissible, however, to adhere to these errors, though? Can one safely follow these popes?
Well, it depends what you're referring to. I mean, what errors are you referring to? Paul VI said that there's nothing dogmatic that is binding as a matter of Catholic faith, divine and Catholic faith. So we certainly don't have to assent to any novelties that were taught as Catholic faith. The things that the council reiterated, right? The divinity of Christ, the supernatural nature of the church, the sinlessness of Our Lady. Of course, that's been previously taught. And of course, we continue to assent to those teachings with divine and Catholic faith, but it's the novelties. It is the novelties that we should not follow, such as religious liberty, this erroneous teaching that man has the right to worship the way he sees fit. No, no, no. And why do we know that's erroneous? Because higher and more authoritative teachings have condemned that view. Okay, this isn't, again, a matter of private judgment. We know that popes in the past, Pius the IX, the 10th, the 11th, Leo the 13th, have condemned religious liberty, have condemned ecumenism. You know, we can point to Mortalium Animus and Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Errors and on and on and on. So it's by looking at what the church has always taught dogmatically that bound us to believe, we then can use that, and we're supposed to use it to evaluate teachings that the church has not bound us to, that the popes have said, hey, this has come out of a pastoral council, nothing's been, defined. Where does that leave us? That leaves us with tradition. So we always go back to all the fathers and the doctors that said, when in doubt, adhere to the tradition. And there are things from the council that do not adhere to tradition, and hence we resist them. We do not follow them.
This one says, do Sedevacantists reject the church's teachings on visibility? Would you say that that's your assessment?
Yes, they absolutely do. And I'll tell you why. Because the church and the theologians who talk about visibility refers to the visible social unit of the church, which consists of a hierarchy of a pope, bishops, priests, deacons, religious, and faithful, by which you formally know that it is the Catholic Church, because there is no other institution outside of it that has that visible structure. Okay. And that's what we mean about the church being visible. If you say that the church is reduced to a body of believers, even though the believers themselves are visible, you are not referring to the visible social unit, a hierarchy of bishops, popes, priests, deacons, and so forth. And effectively what you've done, as I've mentioned, is you've reduced the definition to the church to the Protestant definition. This is exactly what the Protestants say the church is, that the church, the true church, is the body of true believers that hold the apostolic faith. It's exactly what the Sedevacantists call the church today. They no longer recognize the church as the visible social unit, the hierarchy, the visible legal structure, which is the church, which will exist until the end of time. They say that that no longer exists and it is defected. And that's why they've, in fact, the ones that have defected from the church. That's what we mean by visibility.
This one may not represent your position well, so take issue with it if it doesn't. If Francis is presently in spiritual formal heresy, then are you admitting the Sedevacantists recognize what God presently recognizes, which is that Francis is not the Pope? Is that accurate and indicative?
No, of course not. It's not accurate. First of all, I never said he was in spiritual formal heresy. What I did say is if somebody has severed themselves spiritually from the church by the sin of heresy, it doesn't necessarily follow that they are a public and notorious heretic, because that refers to the external form. Again, the external form would require, for them to be a heretic in the external form would require the social bond to the church to be severed, either by the church's judgment or by a public and notorious defection from the church, where somebody chooses another rule of faith. So what I said is, he may be, and there may be clerics who have spiritually severed themselves from the church, but nevertheless remain members of the church. And if they remain members and clerics of the church, they retain their jurisdiction.
I also think the next one is not reflecting your position very well, so maybe take issue with it. Vatican II solemnly promulgated its heretical teachings on religious liberty, which you reject, and says that it contains that it's contained in divine revelation. Is that accurate of your position?
What is the question? That they solemnly promulgated a heretical teaching on religious liberty. I never said it rose to the level of heresy. I said that the church or the council taught that a man has a right to religious liberty. Okay. Well, if you interpret that to mean a right to worship any way he wants, that would be contrary to church teaching. But if you interpret that to mean that he has a right to profess his Catholicism, then it's entirely consistent with Catholic teaching.
Now, but would you say, I guess, as a follow-up question, do you reject Vatican II's teaching on religious liberty, carte blanche, I guess?
Yeah, I see Michael Diamond. Maybe it's Michael or Peter. Yeah, of course I reject it, because man does not have a right to worship the way he sees fit. But the church hasn't bound us to that teaching. Again, it came from a pastoral council. The popes have said it doesn't have to be believed with divine and Catholic faith. It wasn't promulgated as a matter of divine and Catholic faith. And therefore, I, as a Catholic, if I see that it's contrary to tradition and contrary to the teachings of prior popes, then I'm bound to reject it, which I do.
Yeah. It seems like Father Chad Ripperger has two really good books on this, on the Magisterium. One of them is The Binding Force of Tradition. He talks about the different levels of the Magisterium and the levels of assent that are required as far as adherence to those teachings. And then if there's a previous tradition of teachings that takes higher precedence over something else that's taught later, you give assent to the perennial teachings. And that could be the case. If Vatican II perhaps taught error on religious liberty, it could be the case that assent is given to a previous different perennial teaching throughout the Magisterium. So he takes up some of this.
The teachings of the council are really problematic. The way these modernists write, it's very difficult to understand exactly what they mean.
And even that's part of the problem.
Even learned Sedevacantists, and there are some that have properly said that to the extent it requires a number of steps of reasoning to conclude that something's heretical, means it's not heretical on its face, right? Because there is not a direct denial of Catholic dogma, which is the case with religious liberty. It requires extra steps of reasoning to determine what it's actually saying, and it's quite difficult to really understand what it's saying.
It really
because
is.
It doesn't come right out and say man has a right to worship false religions. It doesn't say that. Okay, but you can interpret it with several steps of reasoning to conclude that, but of course it didn't say that. So it can't be considered heretical on its face.
I would agree. There's ways in which you could interpret it in a good way and then in a negative way, and that was the intention behind the wording, so that ambiguity could later on be exploited after the council, but that it could pass in such a way that it looked orthodox so that the bishops would allow it to pass through the council and enter into the magisterium. And so that's why I think when it comes to Vatican II, it's really not that clear cut. I'm not saying that there aren't any problems with Vatican II. I'm just saying I don't think that anybody can show definitively 100% that it is teaching heresy. I think that you can interpret it that way.
The great scholar, right, the great Brazilian scholar De Silveira, who we were honored enough to receive a glowing endorsement to our book, unfortunately, right before he passed. He called it hereticizing, the language that these modernists use, where they can't be accused of directly denying an article of faith. They write it in such a way to confuse, to save themselves from the judgment, right? But also confuse the faithful and ultimately to lull them into error. That's how insidious and evil and deceptive this modernism is, because it doesn't come right out and say what it really probably intends in many cases.
Last question. How do you respond to Sedevacantists who say that your book has misrepresented them and is weak?
They have to prove where we've misrepresented them. It's hard to misrepresent them when we quote them directly. We quote them directly and we provide all of the references to them. And since the book's been published, they've done us a great service of attempting to extricate themselves from all the inconsistencies that they've been promoting for so many years. And believe me, we're covering all of those in our book as well. So I would tell them to keep their arguments coming, because the more they attempt to defend their position, the more we're going to put a spotlight on their errors and the more clear it's going to become for everybody to see.
And so nobody has written an actual formal reply to this book. Is that correct? They're just mainly articles here and there, or just informal critiques?
Articles here and there, and Robert, Cisco, and I have responded to these articles on our website, True or False Pope. And it's allowed us to further refine argumentation, which again has been a great service to our work.
All right. Well, Mr. Salza, thank you so much for coming on. I know we were aiming for about an hour. I kept you a little long, so I apologize. Thank you so much for coming on. This was excellent. You're welcome on the show anytime. I'd love to have both you and Robert Cisco on in the future if y'all are available. But again, thank you so much for your time and what you've done, especially with this book.
Well, thank you, Michael. God bless you and all your viewers. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to put in a plug? I know we have johnsalza.com. I know we have trueorfalsepope.com. Anything else that you want to plug?
Well, johnsalza.com is currently under construction, but so I'm doing my work primarily with Robert through trueorfalsepope.com.
Okay.
If you would like information on Fatima, I just did a reprint of my book, a third edition on the Catechism of Fatima. And if you want a copy of that book, feel free to contact me through trueorfalsepope.com and I'll get you a copy.
Excellent. Okay. And again, thank you so much for coming on. I want to have you on again. Everyone, thank you for watching, commenting, participating, bearing with us through that technical difficulty there. Please comment, like, share this material on your social media. And thank you for watching. God bless you all. Until next time, go share your faith.